So it's my pleasure to invite Tom Williams to talk today. So as we were chatting just before, actually, I've been knowing Tom for 6 years now. We met for the first time at HRI 2015, where I at Pioneer together. And so today I'm very excited to hear you again because I've heard you 1 hour ago. But like now it's a different talk on secret agents, how robots have their own inner life that we can think about, but they're also living themselves. And just quick background on Tom. So he's assistant professor at Colorado School of Mines. He has his lab as a Mirror Lab, and which is a mind interactive robot research lab. And Tom had his PhD in Tufts with Matthias Schreutz before. And he covers quite a wide range of research focuses from natural language understanding and generation, and to trust and human-robot interaction. So I'm very excited to listen to you today, Tom. And so the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I promise not to talk about Argentinian literature like I did in my AI HRI talk. I'm going to be talking today about secret agents, which is just a fun way of saying that I'll be talking about agency, different perspectives on agency, robots not just as agents, but as moral agents and social agents, and as moral and social agents, and the implications of all of these. So to start off, put on my professor hat for a second and say, so what is an agent? Let's talk just a little bit, defining some terminology before we jump in. So we like to use in our lab the definition of agency that comes from 3D and Sanders in the philosophy literature, where they say that an agent is something that is autonomous, interactive, and adaptive. That is, it can change its state without stimuli, it can change its state in response to stimuli, and it can change its internal state transition rules by itself. Or really, what they say is it has these capabilities at a particular level of abstraction. That is, from a particular perspective, a viewer would say that it appears to be autonomous or interactive or adaptive. And here, this caveat of appearance is really critical because it means that something that does not seem to be an agent to us as roboticists because it's too simple, or because we know that it's Wizard of Oz or puppeteered, and so we would say, well, it's not really an agent. For naive users, it may well be an agent because from their perspective, it does seem to be autonomous and interactive and adaptive. And so this raises a question of what leads people to view robots as agents. So from the user's perspective, what connotes this sense of agency? And this relates to questions of robots, when robots seem to have a sense of self, when it seems like there's a social other that you are there interacting with. And in our lab, we've been starting to look at these questions about how robots can perform the having of a sense of self. This is relevant due to some advancements that have been made recently at sort of what I view as the intersection between HRI and the philosophy of mind. So specifically, there's been this really fantastic work coming out of Aaron Steinfeld's lab at Carnegie Mellon from folks like his student Sam Rieg and Michael Luria, where they've been looking at design patterns like re-embodiment and co-embodiment. Co-embodiment, for example, is when you have multiple brains inside the same body. There's multiple agents within a single body, and you can interact with them at the same time. And this raises some questions for us. So if you have multiple minds in a single body at the same time, then we would argue it's reasonable that you might develop different degrees of trust and maybe different types of trust in those different agents. And thus, the amount of trust you develop in the robot as a whole is different from the amount of trust you're developing with each of these agents that are inside the body. So if there's two agents, Alex and Avery, in a single body, maybe you have one level of trust in Alex, you have a different level of trust in Avery, and you're going to have yet another level of trust in the physical robot body. So it's important here to differentiate between these different agents that are in the environment and how the body and identity and mind sort of get nuanced and differentiated in this way. Of course, the typical way that in HRI that we look at robots is discrete agents, right? We might have three agents. Suppose you are walking down the street in Madison and you get accosted by three robots that introduce themselves as Alex and Avery and Adrian. Well, these are three separate robots. And so there are sort of 6 different places where we're putting trust here. We're putting trust in the identity of Alex, the agent, of Avery, the agent, and of Adrian, the agent. And we're separately maybe developing trust in each of their bodies based off of their physical capabilities. Now, what I've just done to you is lied to you a little bit. I presented this example of you encountering these robots, Alex and Avery and Adrian, and I implied that these were 3 different agents. But of course, if you are encountering any case in today's world where there are multiple robots that you are interacting with simultaneously, it's very likely that those robots are actually controlled by a single system. It's likely that they are networked together, and at least to some extent, their behavior is coordinated by some external system. What we could say then is that for this type of system, there's one intelligence behind the scenes, but to users, because these robots are presenting themselves as distinct, they're using different names, for example, people are going to perceive them as being 3 different social others they're interacting with, even though to us behind the scenes, we might say, well, technically it's just the one cognitive architecture behind the scenes. So designers, by communicating identities in different ways, can thus lead users to develop different understandings of the social others in their environments. Through our design choices, we can lead users to perceive groups of robots as multiple distinct agents who they're interacting with, or as a single collective or a hive mind, for example. And this has led us to, we had a paper at HRI last year where we formalized some of these notions in what we call deconstructed trustee theory. And the idea here is that the notions of who we say we're trusting in human-robot trust really need to be deconstructed into multiple places where trust is located. We need to be separately thinking about trust that's placed in the mind and trust that's placed in the body. And this is in addition to the existing ways that people are deconstructing human-robot trust into, for example, capacity and moral trust. And this has led us to several predictions that we have tested and are testing in ongoing work. For example, that we would expect different levels of trust, again, should be built and lost in people's conceptions of bodies and identities, regardless of whether as developers we would say that there are different identities behind the scenes. For users, they are going to still be developing these different mental representations where they are allocating trust in different ways. We would also predict that different robot identity performance strategies, so for example, robots presenting themselves as individuals versus presenting themselves as a hive mind, or taking certain behaviors that make sense under a framing of distinct individuals or hive mind, may change how concrete the mental representations people are building are, and how stable the trust is how stable is the trust that is being allocated to these different trust loci. And finally, you'd predict that different trust affecting actions, so for example, blameworthy and praiseworthy actions, may differentially affect the concreteness of or trust built in each of these loci. So Bertramala, for example, has some recent evidence showing that blame is much more nuanced and differentiated than praise. And so we might argue, and we found in some of our experiments, that when robots take blameworthy actions, it leads to more distinctness between the amount of trust that's placed in bodies versus identities, because people are being a little bit more sensitive to who they should be blaming than they would be if everything was going well. Okay, so this is sort of weird stuff at the intersection of philosophy of mind and multi-robot distributed systems. Why does this matter? Well, again, if users perceive robots as human-like, if people develop mental models of robots that are similar to the mental models they develop of other humans who do have, maybe we could argue, a distinct and one-to-one mind-body connections, if users are perceiving robots in this human-like way, and as a human-like agents that are autonomous, interactive, and adaptive in the way that people are, then we would argue that they will likely mentally reason about robots and try to interact with them in the same way that they do humans. So this raises a question of how do people reason about other people? This is what in the psychology literature we would refer to as theory of mind. And psychologists argue that there's at least two different types of theory of mind, or ways that we reason about other people. And we can depending on how you feel about dual route theories of cognition, we can view this as maybe a fast, instinctive way of reasoning about other people and a slow, deliberative way of reasoning about other people. First, we can very quickly assess what things we think other people are aware of and maybe how aware of them we think they are without really much cognitive effort. And we can also slowly and deliberatively reason about what we think others are likely to believe about those objects. In this case, for example, with these two agents here, the agent in the white hat might reason very quickly about whether the other agent is aware of the folder that he is holding, might reason about whether the other agent is familiar with it, whether the other agent, whether the folder is activated in the mind of the other agent, whether the other agent is focusing on it. These assessing, we would argue, these different tiers of cognitive status is an example of this type of very fast reasoning that we're able to perform without a lot of cognitive effort. And in some of our recent work, we've been looking at how robots can perform exactly the same type of what's called givenness hierarchy theoretic cognitive status modeling, where robots estimate for different objects in their environment how likely it is that interlocutors are aware of those objects, how likely it is that they're focusing on them, how likely it is that they're just merely familiar with them, and so forth. And found that we're able to automatically learn models to predict this type of information just as well as we would be if we were using the hard-coded information from the linguistics literature. This is important, not just because it's a type of reasoning that people do, but because people use this type of reasoning for very concrete interactive tasks. So in humans, for example, we use this information about what we think the cognitive status of a piece of information is in the mind of an interlocutor to decide how to talk about it. So the givenness hierarchy theoretic literature from linguistics would say that based off of cognitive status, we can decide what types of pronouns to use, for example. So if we think that somebody we're talking to is already focusing on something, then we can say it instead of generating a long description, like the folder I hold in my hand. And so similarly, we've been using this cognitive status information in order to enable this same type of referring form selection choice, enabling robots to reason about humans and their mental states the way that humans reason about other humans' mental states, and use this in order to generate ideal referring forms, choosing to decide to refer to something as it or this or that in a way that is very, very similar to the way that humans make these choices. And in doing so, we found that this cognitive status information, whether something is in focus or activated familiar, is the single most informative feature for making this type of decision. This is also important because people intentionally manipulate other agents' cognitive states. So if you are lazy and you don't want to generate a really long description of something, but the thing you're talking about isn't already in focus or activated to the person you're talking about, well, you might gesture to it. You could point to something, and by pointing to it, you activate it in the other person's mind. And this allows you to just say this instead of saying something really long and convoluted. Another point here, just as a note, notice on this slide, when I was trying to get your attention to talk about this sort of pointing gesture so that I could refer to it efficiently, I circled it. This is another type. It's very similar to the way that we physically gesture to things, these types of visual cues that we use. And this is relevant because, in fact, we've been looking at ways that robots can generate these types of visual cues as well. So we've been looking at robots that are interacting with humans in domains where those humans are wearing augmented reality headsets, and looking at ways that robots can generate these mixed reality gestures, for example, drawing circles around things, drawing arrows to things. And what we found is that these types of visualizations are particularly effective as a replacement for physical gesture, especially under ambiguity and when combined with descriptive language. And we think that this is potentially really valuable in domains like drones, for example. You're not going to want to mount an arm on the bottom of a drone just so it can point to things. And so using these types of visualizations might be a much more effective way to allow those types of morphologically constrained robots to generate effective cues that allow them to communicate in the way that humans do. We've been looking at this with these types of mixed reality gestures, again, like circles and arrows. We've also been looking at virtual arms, though, for example, looking at the different types of gestures that are possible with virtual arms that may not be possible with physical arms, and then looking at the differences between the effectiveness of these different types of gestures. And one of the things we found, for example, is that using these visualizations like arrows or circles that it directly picks something out are much better for accurately and quickly highlighting the object that's being talked about. But when you use a virtual arm, people view the robot as more human-like and warm and competent. So these different types of virtual gestures are useful for different types of purposes, depending on what your objectives are. So the overall takeaways of this first part of the talk are that people perceive robots as interactive, autonomous, and adaptive, which means that to users, regardless of what the philosophers might say about like the real notion of whether or not robots are agents, to people, robots are agents. To users, not to say philosophers aren't people, but to users, robots are agents. Second, designers can manipulate people's mental representations of robot agents through different identity performance strategies. People, through their designers, through their design cues, can change how people conceptualize the social others in their environment. People also do expect robots to reason about their own mental states. So when people perceive an agent or a social other, they expect it to reason about their own mental states. And then robots can estimate people's mental states and use them to communicate with people in unique ways. So in the second part of my talk, I'm going to argue that robots are moral agents. They are agents capable of moral action. I see in the chat. Hopefully everybody can see my video now. Flaherty and Sanders conceptualize, again, moral agents as agents under their same framework that are capable of moral action, that is doing moral good or moral harm. Robots are capable of doing moral good and moral harm. Obviously, robots have potential for physical risks. This is true in domains like space exploration or search and rescue, where there are real physical risks. But robots also have potential for moral good or moral harm socially and emotionally in domains that we care about increasingly in HRI, like elder care and child-robot interaction. There's real potential for good or harm, morally relevant actions outside of the physical domain, right? So doing emotional harm, or we would argue doing fundamental moral harm, that is doing harm to people's underlying senses of morality. Specifically, we hypothesize that because robots to people are moral agents, people will expect them to follow moral norms, but moreover, will take moral cues from robots, will use robots' actions and opinions to inform their own beliefs about what is right and wrong. And we argue that this could lead to unintentional negative moral influence. So the general argument structure here is that robots responding to unethical commands, for example, even if they don't intentionally, condone an immoral action, merely the action of not explicitly rejecting an inappropriate command could communicate a willingness to perform that command. This could mislead people about the robot's ethical programming. This could influence humans' beliefs about what moral norms apply in the current context, which could negatively impact their own sense of morality. And this makes sense because a major tenet of modern behavioral ethics is that morality in humans is dynamic and malleable. It changes over time. It changes from place to place. And technology mediates humans' perceptions and actions in ethically relevant ways. Technology literally changes the way we see the world. It changes the set of actions we view as available to us in the world in ethically relevant ways. So we would argue that even for robots that are simply not actively rejecting inappropriate commands, they could be negatively impacting people's systems of morality. And we found this in experiments. We found that when robots take communicative actions that don't condone, but also don't explicitly reject inappropriate commands, people believe that those commands are not only more likely to be followed by the robot, but they also rate for themselves the actions as slightly more acceptable in that context in which they're observing these interactions. And so in some of our architectural work, we've been looking at ways to ameliorate this, right? So when you get a command and you could reply to it in some way that where there's a risk of accidentally condoning an inappropriate action, you spin up the different ways of interpreting that command, and then before responding, for example, before asking for clarification between different potentially inappropriate actions, you examine each of those actions, then use this to decide whether or not you're going to ask for clarification. I can talk about that later if you're interested, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because ultimately our goal shouldn't just be about robots avoiding miscommunication. Our goal shouldn't just be not accidentally condoning an action by refusing to refuse it. Instead, we argue that robots avoiding miscommunication of moral principles is good, but moreover, when robots receive immoral commands or inappropriate commands, regardless of whether or not those commands are ambiguous, for example, they need to actively push back on them. And so at this past year's IROS, for example, we had a best paper nominated paper where we started to look at how robots can automatically reject inappropriate commands in nuanced ways. So specifically, we combined the robot architecture that we use in our lab and its natural language and goal reasoning capabilities with a context recognition system from a collaborator's lab and a task planning system that we use for normal-aware reasoning from another collaborator's lab, and showed how we could reject commands in a way that was context sensitive. That is not just about whether or not an action is right or wrong, but whether an action is permitted in particular contexts. We could reject commands in a way that required multi-step moral reasoning. So that is not just rejecting a command to perform an immediate action, but rather reasoning about the sequence of actions that would be required to achieve some future state, and then rejecting commands to achieve that state if achieving it would require an inappropriate action somewhere along the chain, and then using this information to automatically provide the reasoning for why certain commands would need to be rejected on moral grounds. However, like most previous work on machine ethics, this work that I'm talking about was grounded entirely in norms. And in some of our recent work, we've been exploring the use of other types of moral frameworks beyond simply deontological or norm-based ethics. For example, we've been doing a lot of work recently in Confucian role ethics. I realize this might prompt some questions. I'm guessing most people on the call are not familiar with Confucian role ethics, so just a very brief introduction. So Confucian ethics highlights a need for self-reflection and for self-cultivation of moral virtues. It highlights a need to focus on the roles we play in relationships with others, and it focuses on rituals and practical wisdom and actions we can take in order to encourage our own self-reflection and self-cultivation. And we argue that Confucian role ethics for robots may be particularly appropriate for a couple reasons. First, this focus on well-defined social and relational structures is a good fit for robots and sort of plays well with current frameworks in human-robot teaming. And second, this focus on moral self-cultivation and care for others, we think, is a really refreshing perspective, rather than just the sort of solely autonomous individualistic perspective that is highlighted in traditional deontological perspectives. And so we've been arguing that if we want to take an approach grounded through a Confucian role ethic perspective, we need to be changing how we view robot moral competence in general. So people like my advisor in grad school, Matthias Scheutz, him and Bertram Mala argued that for morally competent robots, we need a system of norms, and we need to use those norms for moral cognition and decision-making and communication. And we argue, sure, yeah, that's probably true, but we also need robots to be able to reason about the roles they play, their relationships with others, actions that are considered beneficial with respect to their roles and relationships, and then to be able to use that role-sensitive reasoning in the context of moral cognition, moral decision-making, moral communication. And so we've been thinking about this in a variety of ways. To start, we've thought about, well, what are the roles that we want robots to be playing in society? And so we start by looking at the Confucian literature from, thousands of years old. There they look at relational roles like ruler, minister, father, son, husband, wife, older, younger. These are maybe not the types of relational roles we care about in today's modern society, and also maybe not the types of relational roles that robots are going to be involved in. And so instead, we've been looking at other types of relational roles that we see in the human-robot teaming literature, like owner-ownee, supervisor, subordinate, teammate, adept, novice. We've also been thinking a little bit about it. We talked about this actually at AI HRI earlier this morning, about other types of relational roles that may occur outside of human-to-human relationships. For example, the relationships that people have with dogs or other types of animals, and how those types of relationships may carry over into human-robot interaction. We've also been looking at how we can encode these types of relational roles logically, either through a sort of traditional logic programming, or I've done a lot of work historically with like Dempster-Shafer theory, and how we can use those types of frameworks to encode knowledge of roles and relationships in sort of an uncertainty and ignorance amenable way. And then we've been looking at how we can use those types of knowledge representations and the algorithms for using them in order to generate role-grounded moral communication. In a variety of contexts, either remonstration, accusation, all the different ways that we as humans engage in moral dialogue with each other. Just as an example of how that might look differently, a traditional sort of norm-based perspective on generating moral rejections might be to say, well, yeah, so to go off of Bill Gay's comment in the chat, I'm afraid I can't do that, Dave. Yeah, so like I can't do that because that would be stealing, and stealing is wrong. So it's focusing on the action and the implicit or the underlying rightness or wrongness of the action itself. In contrast, a role-based explanation might be to say something like, I can't do that because that wallet belongs to my friend Sean, and a good friend wouldn't do that, which is centering the roles the robot is playing in its relationships with others, which we argue could help. Our hope is that it could help people to engage in these practices that are encouraged from the Confucian perspective, that is reflection and providing opportunities for moral self-cultivation. And so I said before that from the Confucian perspective, there's an emphasis on the roles we play in relationships, in our relationships with others. Hold on. There's a focus on moral self-cultivation and self-reflection, and there is a focus on ritual practice and and opportunities for moral practice. And all of these are important. In fact, in some work that's under review right now, what we found is that role-based explanations can be more effective at encouraging cultivation of people's moral attitudes relative to, for example, norm-based moral explanations, but only when that role-based moral guidance is followed by opportunity for moral practice. So when somebody receives a role-based or norm-based piece of advice, and then they have an opportunity to put that into practice, then after that moral practice, the role-based explanations were more effective for encouraging a positive change in people's moral attitudes. This focus on social relational ontology is really important, we argue, from a general robot design perspective. So we've been looking at, for example, asking what are the key roles in relationships in other contexts. So for example, even without autonomous robots. So we've been looking at how therapists teleoperate robots in the context of therapy with autistic children, for example, and looking at the different roles and relationships that are involved in those robotics contexts outside of automation. And we've been looking at for example, how the needs and perspectives of these different stakeholders that have these different roles and these different relationships can be taken into account. So both understanding the therapists and the relationships they have with the robot and how that manifests in different needs, and then the children and how certain qualitative research techniques can be used to get the insights into children's perspectives as stakeholders of the ethical concerns that they have about these robotic technologies, given the different relational roles that they have with the robots. So the takeaways of the second part of the talk, is that people perceive robots as capable of moral action. This means that robots are moral agents. 2, people thus reason about their moral beliefs, about robots' moral beliefs and moral actions, and take cues from robots' inferred, observed, or communicated beliefs. And we're exploring context-sensitive, norm-based and role-based approaches to robotic moral reasoning and moral communication, and we're exploring role-sensitive approaches to social robot design. In the third part of my talk, I'd like to argue that robots are social agents. Again, these are agents that are capable of social action. If you look at Floridi and Sanders, again, so they view moral agents as agents capable of moral action, where moral action is action that has the capacity for moral good or moral harm. And we have been viewing social agents as agents capable of social action, where we define social action as actions that either affirm or threaten a human's positive face, that is their self-image, or their negative face, that is their sense of autonomy. So if we visualize this, at the core, we've got this concept of agency. That is, an agent is something that appears from a particular level of abstraction to be autonomous, interactive, and observable. And moral agency additionally requires this capacity for moral for moral action. And we argue in some of our work that social agency is, again, agency plus this ability to either affirm or threaten face. Our hypothesis under this framing is that because robots are social agents, users will expect them to follow human politeness norms. This is, instead of just the expectation to follow moral norms, there's this expectation to follow politeness norms, and that similarly, like with moral agency, people will take politeness cues from robots. This is actually related to some work that I did during my dissertation, the very last sort of piece of work I did in my dissertation, where I did a lot of work on indirect speech acts. An indirect speech act, or ISA, is an action, an utterance whose literal meaning mismatches its intended meaning. So, for example, if you say, "Do you know what time it is?" you don't expect the other person to just say yes. Even though "do you know what time it is" literally a yes or no question, we understand by cultural convention, based off of sociocultural politeness norms, that when somebody says that, what they really mean is, "Tell me the time." Similarly, if I say, "Could you bring me a Coke?" you understand that this isn't a yes or no question. It's intended as a command, but I'm being polite, and so I'm sort of obscuring this threat to your autonomy. And so when I was a PhD student, we asked, do people actually use this type of polite language towards robots? They don't have to. And if so, how might indirect language use in HRI be modulated by context? And what we found is that, yes, people use lots of this indirect polite language towards robots, and the amount that they use is very sensitive on context. So specifically in sort of non-social contexts that people are not familiar with, not a lot of social norms carrying over, people used a lot of indirect speech acts, but it was, the median was like 20%. About 1 in 5 things that people would say to the robot was framed indirectly. In contrast, in domains with strong social conventions, like restaurant contexts, almost everything people said to robots was indirect. 3/4 on average of what was said to a robot was framed indirectly, which means if robots aren't able to understand indirect speech acts, they're going to misunderstand 3/4 of what's said to them. So we tested this out. So in this experiment, actually what we did is we, in one of our conditions, we had a robot that it responded to everything directly. It didn't appear to understand indirect speech acts. So here we have an example of this poor person trying to order a water. So they say, the robot says, "Please tell me your order." The person says, "Can I have one water?" The robot says, "Yes, that is permissible." So the person says, "Great, I'll take one water." Okay. I will take one water. That's like a statement about the future. It's like a prediction. So the robot says, "Thank you for sharing that interesting prediction. Please tell me your order." And the person goes through this whole chain of indirect speech acts trying to order a water. Can I order one water? Can you bring me one water? May you bring me one water? I would like to have one water. Can you bring me one water? May you please bring me one water? So can you do it? Can you go inside and get the water for me? Before they finally give up and say, "My order is water." So at any point, this person could have just said, like, "Bring me a water," or "My order is water," literally responding to the robot. But we have this really strong desire to interact with robots in social contexts the same way we would interact with people in social contexts. And thus we need to be understanding that people view robots as social agents, and robots need to be designed to respond accordingly. So takeaways here, robots are viewed as capable of social action. That means that they are social agents, and thus people take socially appropriate actions towards robots, and we would argue expect them to do the same. So in the final part of my talk, I want to talk about the combination of these things I've talked about. So robots are moral agents and they're social agents. And this combination is important. My student Blake Jackson argues, for example, that robots, especially language-capable robots, occupy a unique socio-technical niche that grants them high perceived social agency and moral agency, which together lead to uniquely high persuasive power. In addition, critically, rejecting commands isn't just about refusing to do wrong. So we've looked specifically a lot at blame-laden moral rebukes. This is when you tell me to do something wrong, and I say no, but I say no in a way that casts blame on you. And from a Confucian perspective, we would argue that these are critical for positively wielding moral influence. Blame-laden moral rebukes encode a tension where you are trying to uphold a moral norm, but in order to do so, you need to violate a social norm. You need to be a little bit impolite towards the person, calling them out on what they asked of you in order to help cultivate a flourishing moral ecology for both them and other people who may be observing. So this is really interesting, we think, this tension between social and moral norms. And one research question we have is, how severe should robots be when responding to norm violations? And you could say, well, maybe robots should just be as polite as possible when rejecting commands. But what we found is people actually want robot responses to be well calibrated and proportional. People don't like it if a robot's response to a minor norm violation is a complete overreaction. And people also don't like it, although they don't care quite as much about the robot being too polite. If they had to go one way or the other, maybe they'll prefer the robot to be overly polite, but in general, people don't like that either. People don't like the robot being sort of hand-wavy, wishy-washy in response to a really severe violation. However, what we've also found is that these effects are highly sensitive to human and robot gender. People don't like female-presenting robots rejecting commands. This is an example of overt sexism carrying over from human-human interaction into human-robot interaction. And people don't like robots that are rejecting commands that came from women. This is perhaps an example of benevolent sexism carrying over. And this is a minefield for robot designers. So as robot designers, we often use metrics like likability or like willingness to adopt and say, okay, under this design, with this design pattern, people like the robot more. They're going to want to use it. That's a good thing. However, sometimes the designs that encourage likability, achieve likability by playing into gender norms and stereotypes and biases that we don't want to perpetuate. So this presents a big challenge, and we've been starting to look at this specifically in the context of gendered abuse and responses to sexist commands recently in collaboration with people like Katie Winkle from KTH in Sweden. And we've been thinking about the same way that robots can perform having a sense of self, how robots can perform gender in different ways, either through their name, how they look, the voice they use, their behavior, and how that behavior may conform with or subvert certain norms. And some of the key points here are that all of these can be changed dynamically. The name, look, voice, and behavior for robots can change on the fly. And so this raises questions about, should these cues, first of all, be chosen? Who should choose them? Should users be able to choose the name and look and voice and behavior and allow their robots to sort of conform to the extent to which they want with some of these norms and stereotypes? Should designers be choosing this? Should robots themselves be choosing their names and looks and voices and behaviors? And one way to think about that is, should robots be changing dynamically, either between interactions, how they look, how they behave, what name they use? Should robots be changing these within interactions? Are there cases in which that could be beneficial or problematic? How do users perceive and make sense of changes in these types of cues? And these are all research questions that we're really interested in, but are only starting to look at. This is all grounded in a workshop paper that we published at HRI last year. Another point here is how this ties in with the identity performance strategies that we talked about before. We talked about how identities you can have multiple identities inhabiting the same body. And the folks at Carnegie Mellon have also looked at things like re-embodiment, how identities can hop between bodies. You have an identity in one body, and then you go and interact with another robot, and the identity follows. Now the identity is in that other body. What happens when you've previously had one identity in a robot body with certain gender cues, and now another identity hops into it that performs gender in a different way? How do people make sense of that? Are people okay with this? I have no idea, but it's super interesting. We've also been thinking about things like how will users' perceptions of gender change as identities are hopping into bodies with more or less stereotypically congruous bodies. So not just the identities that are in the bodies, but the bodies themselves. And we've been thinking about how the choices overall, how these choices of gender cues can either reinforce or subvert gender norms. We've been asking, should we be playing into gender norms and stereotypes when it increases task performance or not? And how can subversion of gender norms and stereotypes be used within sort of an explicitly feminist pro-social justice design stance? And here, Katie, our collaborator from KTH, has been really instrumental in helping drive some of this work forward. And so we've been collaborating with her and her postdoc advisor, Yolanda Leite, as well as with a researcher from Japan, Drazen Brezek, to think about this sort of explicitly feminist design stance. And as an example, looking at female presenting robots designed to present in terms of their voice, for example, as female, calling out anti-woman sexism in a way that subverts gender norms, being perhaps viewed as overly harsh intentionally in the way that they're calling out this sexism. And so Katie ran a study on that last year, and now we have some work under review where we're looking at how this varies cross-culturally. And what we found is that people generally prefer robots that are not apologetic, that don't. So part of the motivation here is systems like Siri and Alexa. Historically, the way they've responded to towards sexist language is they're sort of by like brushing it off, maybe being apologetic, maybe just being saying I'm not going to engage with that. And in the U.S. and Sweden, especially, over polite, apologetic responses are really just preferred. People want the robot pushing back to some extent, and possibly in a way that subverts some of these gender norms cross-culturally. We've also found that across all three cultures, robots that called out sexism were viewed as more credible in their roles by both men and women. So it wasn't just women wanting the robots to respond to this anti-woman sexism, but across the board, both men and women preferred the robots or viewed the robots as more credible when they were calling out sexist language. So takeaways here are that robots are social and moral agents. Effective communication and interaction requires balanced following of social and moral norms, and designers can choose how they play into versus try to intentionally subvert some of these norms. Yes, we want robots following moral norms, or at least some moral norms. Maybe other norms need to be subverted. And I talked in AI HRI, we talked briefly about this, about maybe we don't want robots to be following laws, maybe because of the ways of how we as a society choose what we criminalize, because that's inequitable. Maybe we don't want robots even playing into those, legally codified norms. All right, so I'll end there. Thanks to all the students who did all the work and the people who paid for it. And just very finally, I'll say, just as a brief shout out, our department is hiring in intelligent systems, specifically machine learning and AI, systems work that helps support machine learning and AI, and human computer interaction work themed around machine learning and AI. So thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
All right, thank you very much, Tom. Really nice talk. We got already a few comments from the chat. So one was Bill Gates' point that re-embodiment was already explored in early 2000s by Mishtai May. And then maybe I can let you, Mike Gleicher, ask your question about indirect speech acts. Or I can ask it for you, Mike.
Oh, sorry, I have to deconnect. So I was wondering, and this is outside of the robot context, the indirect speech acts are a complicated thing. They have all these negative, all these sort of negative things, especially when you deal with children or non-native speakers. Yet we seem to love them. Is there any explanation for them? Why do they persist so well?
So it's two things, right? So one is that by cultural convention, we have sort of learned that they are an effective way to have our language. We want people to do other things, right? We want other people to do things for us, right? And we're sort of selfish in that way. And in order to have other people do things for us, we can be more likely to achieve that, and more likely to be able to achieve that in the long term if we do so in a way that isn't overly face threatening, that allows us to request things from other people without casting doubt on their personal character, and without sort of implying a social relationship between us where we have more power, right? And so indirect speech acts, especially conventionalized indirect speech acts, we've just sort of learned are an effective way that everybody sort of understands that it is an appropriate and effective way for requesting other people to do other things. You said like there's a downside of it being ambiguous, but like all of language is ambiguous, right? And so if we look at like the pronoun work, right? I mean, you could say the same thing about like pronouns, right? Why do we use that to refer to something when it introduces this ambiguity? That is incredibly ambiguous. It could imply, it could refer to essentially anything, but we've sort of learned that when certain conditions hold, it can be really effective for enabling us to get our point across without overburdening the listeners or ourselves. And so ambiguity, I think, is just a natural feature of language. It's not necessarily a downside.
Well, and then just to sort of turn that around, when I say, can you do something, that's kind of, sometimes I'm insulting you. I'm in the implication of, you have to prove it to me. Can you answer this question?
Right.
Of course you can. I don't think you're smart enough to answer the question. Therefore, you have to prove yourself. And so it's almost like it counteracts it's more polite, it's less.
Well, so that's interesting. So there's two pieces here. One is that the way that indirect speech acts often function is by calling attention to something that is obvious, right? So in order for a command to function as a command, one of the felicity conditions is you have to really want the person to do something, or you have to know that they're not already going to do something, right? So if I say like, would you close the window, right? Instead of just saying close the window, that would you is like calling attention to the fact that like, I don't think you were already planning on doing it, right? If I say, can you do something? If I say, can you bring me a coffee? It's calling attention to the fact that like you and I both know that you probably had this capability. And so since it can't function as a command because you and I both know that you already have the answer, it triggers this additional reasoning. However, evidence suggests that like we can very quickly and intuitively interpret the literal meaning of these types of ISAs as well. So a classic example is if I say to you, if you say, oh, I auditioned for Hamilton, and I got this role, and I say, oh, can you sing a high C? Like you don't interpret that as like a request, like an indirect request for you to like sing a high C at this moment. Even though it's a conventionalized form, you're able to quickly reason about the literal meaning and interpret that as well. So the conventionalized form doesn't interfere with our ability to do that other type of reasoning that you're talking about.
Thank you, Tom.
I will also just do it before you ask the next question. I will say Bill Gaze, yes, and thank you for Bill Gaze for like for months ago pointing me to that work in particular, which has been really helpful. And I highlight the work from Carnegie Mellon only because it's really recent and really exciting. But yes, there's been a long tradition of all of this work on that is at this border of like philosophy of mind and self and cognition and robotics and HRI for quite a while.
Thanks, Tom. Kevin, do you want to ask your questions when you put it in the chat?
Yeah, sure. Oh, well, I guess that's not working. So you were talking a lot about how to sort of codify these kinds of social and moral norms and these social reasonings into robots. And one thing that kind of concerned me was if, robot programming is not typically as flexible as a human mind. And over years, the social norms, obviously you gave the example of old social moral norms not being applicable to current roles. Is there a concern that if we, start writing down what is good right now, that's going to hold us back or make us more rigid if we start to have these social agents that are sort of tying us to the present?
Yes, absolutely. I think there are huge questions here about like who, what, when of how who, what, when, and how of how we encode moral norms. So yeah, first, norms change over time, and we need to be able to change them. But on the other hand, we don't necessarily want to be constantly adapting certain norms, especially if we want to be avoiding playing into certain norms that we don't view as socially beneficial, like certain gendered norms, right? Also, like if you just enable your system to adapt your system of norms, I think as willy-nilly, so to speak, you run the risk of the type of situation that you got with Microsoft Tay a couple years ago, where just learning directly from human data and constantly updating based off of human data is a great way to have internet trolls, co-opt your intelligence system and turn it into exactly the opposite of what you wanted. There's also questions here about not just like how, like when we update the norms and how we choose which norms we choose to encode, but like who we're listening to when encoding norms. And I recently read Charles Mills, The Racial Contract. Charles Mills is this American political philosopher who died a couple months ago. And so after he died, I didn't know about him before. I started reading some of his work, and he points out some really interesting things about our moral theories, and specifically about classic contractarians like Locke, Rousseau, Mills, and Kant, and the way that a lot of those traditional sort of like contract theories of government and of morality are grounded in a sort of a default assumption that the obligations and norms that are being talked about are obligations and norms that are holding between white men. And so specifically Kant, for example, at the same time that he was presenting some of his work on deontology and the sort of contractual theories of deontology, he was also presenting his own theories of racial hierarchies. And you can't really divorce them, right? And so we need to be really careful about exactly which like types of moral frameworks we're using and what types of historical assumptions might be based into baked into or helped motivate some of those theories. And then we have to think about, are there ways of using those theories that don't continue those problematic traditions? Are there ways of listening to particular marginalized groups and using their views as the basis for which norms we're programming in and when we're changing them? I think it's a really, really complicated question. I don't have any good answers to it yet. Ultimately, my perspective here is that it's a challenging problem, but it's one I think we are going to need to solve if we want language-capable robots. You could say, let's not have language-capable robots. And I think that's actually even as somebody who does everything in natural language, I think that's a really valid perspective. And one argument is to say, well, let's just design robots that don't have any language capability. It will allow us to avoid a lot of these gendered and racialized and otherwise culture-sensitive stereotypes and biases that carry over from human interaction to human robot interaction. But like a lot of people in HRI, I really think that natural language is a powerful modality. It's going to have present a lot of really positive opportunities for interaction. But if we want that comes along with that sort of power comes the responsibility of tackling some of these moral questions.
Yeah, I actually have a quick follow-up question there. So is it possible to have natural language interaction through that modality without carrying the sort of weight of being a social agent? Because speech is just some frequencies. Is it possible to have that modality without feeling like that's a person?
Well, so there's two different things there. There's the perception of personhood, and then there's separately the perception of social agency, right? The capacity for social action. I think that we view our pets socially in ways that even if we don't perceive them as humans. I guess you could alternatively argue that maybe we do perceive them as humans. We're not willing to admit it. But I think with language, there's always, as soon as you introduce language, it's introducing opportunities for, regardless of what's being said, it's introducing opportunities for affirming or threatening a face. And even if you don't look at what's said, if you just look at the decision to respond to somebody at all, right? If you say something to me and I'm capable of language and I don't respond, right? That seems like a socially relevant decision. It seems like it's a decision that has the potential to threaten your face, right? And so, in a politeness theoretic sense, and so I think that while, of course, the degree of perceptions of capacity for social action are vary dramatically based off of the type of natural language interaction that is possible. Once you have any language capacity at all, I think it necessarily introduces some amount of perception of social action capability and thus of social agency.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so I had a few more questions, but we're running out of time because it's already 1 p.m. Central. So we'll close the public part of the seminar. So I'm thanking again, thank you, Tom, for presenting, and thank you for the audience for attending. And we'll move on. So please stay around, Tom. And I'm stopping the recording too.